guys, and welcome to part 2 of AE102 on Ingesting Media. So in this half we'll be looking at some stuff that's a bit more fun, a bit more interesting. I don't know if fun's the right word, but anyway, this half, that's what we're talking about. That's what this is supposed to be an introduction for. Why am I still talking? This half is going to go into, ingesting transcodes that were made outside of Avid, applying LUTs to them, FrameFlex readjustments before you start working, ingesting image sequences, ingesting audio and making quick adjustments right after ingest, like applying gain, centering, panning, batch to a whole bunch of sound files. And of course different ways of ingesting and bringing in still images. And I know that some editors who have primarily used other NLEs don't particularly like the way Avid handles still images, and I don't always blame them. But there are some things that you can know that will help you, like Avid's Pan and Zoom effect, for example. So we'll be covering all of this stuff, we'll be going into detail, we'll be showing it. Hopefully this is going to be slightly shorter than last week's, and hopefully this is some useful information for you that you can take forward into your lovely editing world projects. So anyway, that's enough intro from me. Let's get started by jumping into ingesting external transcodes into Avid by resuming the recording from last time.
Right, now our last ingest method that I wanted to demonstrate for your main media anyway is bringing in transcodes that were made outside of Avid. So for this I'm going to use my source rushes folder because this project will progress as we go through the chapters. And I'm going to say, day 1 picture. Then if I go to my Finder here, and I have this transcodes folder of day 1 for this particular short film. So how I get those into Avid is the following method. So I go to my drive that I want to put it onto, into Avid Media Files, which will be on the top level of the drive. Ignore this media holding bay folder, that's for me. Then inside MXF, and then here's where the media go. So this is Avid's folder structure. So always the root level of the drive, Avid Media Files, spelled exactly like that with the space and then no space between media and files. MXF, and then numbered folders. And then as long as they're numbered, they're in this format, Avid will be able to see any media that you put into it. Now, if you are using project sharing, like you're on a shared network environment, like an Avid Nexus or something like that, then there'll be one additional step that you'll have to do, which will be to, before you create a numbered folder, you'll also have to put the name of the computer at the head. And this is just so that Avid can recognize all the different machines that are using this shared network, because they could be creating the same numbered folder at the same time. My method for bringing in, when I get transcodes like this, is I'll create a folder named after the date that the shoot day that the materials come from. So in this case it was 2020 August 6th. I'm still using that year month day format talked about in chapter 1, and then I'm going to drag in my MXFs into that folder. Now when I tab back to Avid, you'll see a quick little dialog box come up where Avid will scan this folder and it'll create a couple of new files. So I'll show you here. Let's tab back to Avid, scanned, and it happened very quickly there. You may have blinked and missed it, so I'll show you again. Let's tab back to Avid. There you go. And now if we tab back to that folder, we can see Avid's made 2 new files. So these 2 files are database files. This is Avid creating a little database of everything that it's seen, cataloging all of the files that are in that particular folder. So this one is our most useful one, .mdb, standing for media database. So if I drag this into my bin, it populates the bin with the clips. And that is my way of ingesting these transcodes, like how you would get transcodes that are made outside of Avid into Avid. These ones are made in DaVinci Resolve. This is how I would generally on every job receive my Avid transcodes and how I would get them in. as I demonstrated in my video talking about how to make Avid transcodes inside of DaVinci Resolve, our metadata that we're going to need for relinking later of the source file name is recorded in the tape column. So we're all good and ready to roll with these transcodes on our project. Now that covers all the main ways of bringing material in terms of linking, consolidating, transcodes, different methods. Now I'm just going to highlight a few other things to note on ingesting media and things to do immediately after bringing them in. To start with, we're going to roll all the way back to the start and look at these AMA linked clips. Now, we just saw with our transcodes, or our transcodes made in Resolve, that we have this metadata in the tape column that we can relink to later. And if you've seen my responding to comments video that I dropped recently, number 1, a couple of people had asked about this, about relinking to the source media. And basically, for relinking to the source media, the main thing that we always need for relinking is commonality, is the term I use it. A commonality between your proxies and your original media. For example, if we're relinking in Resolve with this material here, Resolve would naturally add this as in the tape column, and our proxies have that in the tape column, and it would be able to see the connection. And if we're relinking to the source in Avid, we could always dupe this tape column into another metadata column and do the same relink. So when you AMA link in, we don't have any commonality on the source. And before you get started, before you dive too deep into it, that's the very first thing I would do. So all you have to do is select the name column and hit Command D to duplicate this information. This works for any column of metadata really. So you're going to dupe the selected column, and then it asks what column do you want to duplicate it into. So I've got lab role up here. You could also use cam role or disk label, but for the purposes of this, I'm going to use lab role, and I'm going to select lab role there, and then hit OK, and it's done it. So there is our duplicated metadata. So we now have this commonality preserved. So then if you're going to make transcodes out of these AMA linked clips, if you're making your transcodes in Avid, that's done first, and then later down the line, if you want to relink to the source, you have that there with you, and you don't need to worry about it later on. Now, what else might you want to do at this stage, right after bringing stuff in? You might want to apply a LUT. This footage was all shot in log, so I'll show you how you do that. So making any kind of changes or adapters within Media Composer is done using the source settings. So highlighting all your clips, and then right-click source settings here. So we have 5 categories here. I'm not going to look too deep into all of these. The main 2 I'm going to focus on here is color encoding and FrameFlex, but feel free to have a look around all the others in your own time. So we get a preview on the right of our clip. We got a picture graph so as we can see our levels. But if you're wildly wrong, it should be quite obvious there. Up here we can select our source color space, but I'm going to leave this at Rec 709 for now because that's correct. Our color adapter type is just a fancy way of saying, do you want to use the presets that we have here or any of your own personally installed LUTs? I'll show you how to add a LUT in a second. And color adapter is where you'd select what LUT you want to use. I'm going to select this one here, Sony SG Cine to S-Log 709. So I'll add that. My picture looks miles better. And then I can hit apply or apply to all to apply this to all my selected clips here. Apply will just do it to the one that you've got previewed. I'm going to hit apply to all. Now before I jump over to FrameFlex, as promised, I'll just show you how you can import your own LUTs. If you open the color management settings portion here, then you get a number of options, but if you just jump down to the bottom, it asks about installing a LUT. So you can do it on a per project basis or shared across the whole Media Composer. So I'm going to leave it shared, and then you select the LUT file, go and find your LUT wherever it is, select it, hit OK, and then it will be brought in. Now, I've found cube files to work quite well for this. I've had LUTs sent to me that are made in DaVinci Resolve and other stuff. But once you have imported it and it's here, just close that, select user installed LUTs, and then your drop down window under color adapter will show your user installed LUTs. Quite useful if maybe you're doing the transcoding but there's a DIT or a colorist who's made a custom LUT for the project. That happens. Right, now jumping over to FrameFlex, here's where we can make kind of reformatting options to do with the picture. Now we've got two preview windows to the right, so the top one is the overall image, the source image, and the bottom one is what our end product will look like after we make our changes. This bounding box here is our frame. So if I wanted to punch in, you know, just say I just wanted a tighter frame here, I can reduce the size, say to about 85. I got a smaller frame which we can move around here. I can reframe a bit tighter on that car and the post box, and then that will be our frame whenever we load it into the source monitor, and that will be what we're using. Not something I would generally do a lot. I like to have everything available to me, and then I'll use 3D Warp or whatever on my source monitor on my timeline to make any reframes or changes. But you can do it in FrameFlex, especially if there's one change that you have to make across all of your clips when you first bring them in. This is where you would do it. Now, this isn't the best footage to explain FrameFlex since it's 16:9 and I'm on a 16:9 project. So I'm going to go back to that array test footage that I used earlier, and I'm going to link those in. And then I believe, here we are. Here's one of these clips that is in shot. The source clip is a different aspect ratio to our project. So if I open that up in source settings in FrameFlex, then we've got some more options here. More things that we might need to do to make it look right within our project, because it looks really squeezed in. The source image size is 2880 by 2160, so this is relatively high res clip. Now that's how Avid was interpreting it to make it fit in the project, but if you hit this little button here, it'll reset the source image size to the actual source image size of the image. That'll generally be, if I'm interpreting stuff like this, that'll be my first bet. So I'll reset it, and then I'll change my frame aspect ratio back to the project, and then I can move my frame around. This is my 16:9 frame to fit within, this shot material. And that's how I would sort of work with that. So I think that frame would work kind of nicely. And then I'm getting everything that I want there. But we could zoom in, we could punch around, we could squeeze this so everything fits in, but it's in a 4:3 aspect ratio and you're working in 16:9. Odds are you're either going to squish it or you're going to crop it. So I would go for cropping here to preserve 1:1 pixel aspect ratio. So there's my frame. I would go for something like that. I think that looks nice. That would be my frame. I'd apply. And then that's done. And then loading that in the source monitor, that looks way better. So that's how I would use FrameFlex for that. Now, as you may tell, I'm no expert on FrameFlex. It's not something that I have to use a whole lot. I kind of figure out FrameFlex on a use case basis. Considering it's something that I rarely have to use, it's not something you need to worry about too much for the purposes of this Essentials course. And now, as a reminder though, if you had done all this at the start, if you're doing your transcodes in Avid, then I would recommend looking at all of these settings at the AMA stage, and then when you go to do your transcodes, apply those source transformations. And then if you do that, these changes, these reframes, and the LUTs are baked into the image, and it's not requiring Avid to do any background processing to keep those displayed that way. Now, it's not just for relinking as well. There is other metadata that you may want to apply right at the start when you're ingesting. So for example, if I go back to my transcodes, I have a bin layout saved for this here. So I can be looking through my material. I have a bin column I always keep in all my bins called AE notes, where I can just add little notes that then in the bin there for the editor to see of like, you know, oh, they forgot to slate here, you know, there's transcoding artifacts on here, I'm getting it replaced, different things like that, just anything that I spot. I'll always add like the shoot day, so this would be, you know, day 1. I'll add what camera it was. Now this might come through in the metadata on your transcodes and an ALE depending on, you know, your production. But I'll generally add this anyway. So say this is like A-cam. This isn't a multi-camera shoot, but you know, this is A-cam for the purposes of this discussion. If it's a series, I'll add an episode number, and I'll always add a scene number as well. And then that'll help me later on. So this is scene. These were all from scene 16. And then this does really sort of help me out in terms of, see, later on when I open a scene bin with the sync subclips that the editor's working on, and if there was an issue and it requires me to go back to the source, then I can just pull up this bin view and I'll see what shoot day it was, and then I can open that shoot day's source picture bin, and I've got the source clips right there. Now you could always do a match frame and find bin, but occasionally that breaks. So this can be useful as well. Just, I like to have as much metadata in there as I can for tracking. And this isn't an essential step by any means, but this is just a suggestion of stuff that you may want to do. Anything that you need to track, you know, attach it to the clips as metadata. Because any subclips or subsequent clips made out of these will inherit that metadata. Right, let's take a look at audio. So in our source rushes here, I'll go day 1 sound. So go back to my source browser, change this to import, and I'll go to my projects folder. Actually, no, I'll go treasure, day 1, audio. There's all my sound files, and I'll hit import. Now, quite often I'll ask if it's production sound, what start time code do you want to interpret this as? You're always going to want the same as your project. That's what you're going to want to interpret it as. So 2398, OK to all. Bring them in. Done. And close that. I have all of my sound files here. As well as any metadata that came through with the sound, like track 1, you know, is my mix track, my production mix. Track 2 is a boom, another boom, radios. You know, you get the layout will come through quite often with the sound files. We can make quick adjustments to these after bringing them in. We can change the sample rate, we can center pan them, we can alternate the panning, you know, this is more probably if it's sound effects and music. Alternate pan left and right means it'll tweak the discrete sound channels to go pan left, right. So if you come in with 2 channels, it's going to go A1 left, A2 right. But not something you're going to want to do with your production sound, but very useful for music, sound effects, that kind of thing. Remove pan, remove any panning. You can apply gains. Now, this is quite useful if it's like music and sound effects, again, because you can batch lower the sound. So I could go like minus 10 dB and then hit enter, and it'll bring it all down by 10 dB, because sound effects and music do tend to come in quite loud. We can also split all tracks to mono if they had been brought in as stereo. But the proper way to deal with multi-channel audio would be to right-click on the clips, modify, and modify clip, and then in this drop-down box up here, go to set multi-channel audio, and we'll get a little box here. Now this isn't the best one to do this on, because for some reason the sound recorder has skipped A2 and it goes A1, A3, A4. But whenever you have a dual pair, you can set it to, if I just click it, it's going to gang them together in a stereo pair. And then they'll change to a stereo pair, or I can click it, the little drop down menu, and then change it to mono, stereo, depending on how many channels you got. You can group them in all kinds of ways. But I like to always import stuff as mono first, standard, and then I'll tweak the multi-channel audio if I have to here. because I've found sometimes if I've imported it as multi-channel and then put it back to mono, sometimes it wants to revert to stereo and it can cause issues. So import it as mono as standard. Now you should note that in terms of straight importing, particularly if you're on a Mac, you can no longer straight import MP3s. So if I go to try and import this, nothing happens. So if you're using MP3s, you will have to link in transcode or convert the source to a WAV file or something else before you can bring it in. I think Avid are working on it. I hope they are, because MP3s are still extremely common. But for the time being, that's the workflow that we're going to have to deal with. Right, now lastly, I just want to touch on importing still images into Avid, because that can be a whole nother ballgame. So let's take a look. So if I wanted to do a straight import, say on my desktop, what have I got here? I've got this lovely Avid Assistant PNG file. I'll use that. Then in my import settings, there's a number of options to do with an image. We can say don't modify the color levels, or scale them from full range to legal. If that's something I need to do. So for this, I'm just going to say do not modify. Treat it as legal. If it has an alpha channel, and probably if you try and import PNG, it's going to at least assume it does. You have the two options of inverting on import or not inverting. So it's whether or not you treat the white or the black as opaque on the alpha channel. I'm going to hit ignore for that for now. Image size adjustment. So this is whether it's going to resize the image. So if it's sized for current format, it's always going to try and resize it, up or down to fit, the size of your working raster. In this case, 1080p. I'm just going to select don't resize smaller images. If I want it resized or blown up, I'll do that. And then down here we have frame import duration. So this is kind of the stick of how Avid treats still images as opposed to Premiere and Final Cut and Resolve and basically all the other ones. So Avid will create solid media on import of the image, and it will give it a set duration. So basically, if I import this still here, and the default is 30 seconds, it's going to create a 30-second clip of that still. If I want it to last more than 30 seconds, I can stretch it or repeat it or add a time warp effect that'll, repeat the frame with no problem. But by default, it's going to bring it in at a set duration, which can be a bit annoying. The only time I found it particularly frustrating actually was doing 2D edits, editing storyboards for animation. And when doing that, you've got hundreds or thousands of still images that you're editing with. You're editing with the storyboard. And having them locked to a certain duration and always having to apply effects or stretches in different ways can get a bit frustrating. But if you're importing it just quickly to use one still for a specific use case, then it's fine. And the little tick box we've got down here is to do with importing image sequences. So auto detect sequentially numbered files. So you'll have to have that ticked if you want to import an image sequence so that Avid recognizes it as one. Now, depending on what format your image sequence is, you're either going to want to link to it or import it, because the supported formats are sort of spread across the two different methods of ingesting, just so you're aware. So just be aware of that depending on what you're importing. So I'm going to import this little still just now, creating media, and then I've got the Avid Assistant logo up here as a 30-second clip. Now, if I wanted to actually use this picture in a cut, say as part of a title or a logo or something, there is an effect that is sort of the more Avid approved way to bring in stills, which I'll show you quickly. So if I create a timeline here, I'll just call it Avid Assistant. And then in my effects palette, there is an effect under image called Avid Pan and Zoom. So if I have that on my timeline, just over a blank bit of filler somewhere, and then I open it up in Effect Editor, then we have a whole lot of options in terms of importing an image. So I'll just find that same one, Assistant. And the main advantage to doing it this way is it's sort of the only real approved way in Avid to have an image displayed on a sequence at its full native resolution and to play around with it with reframes and keyframing and moving it around, utilizing the full resolution and not having to worry about a set duration that's been applied to it on import. It is a bit of a step to go through, especially if you're having to do these for a lot. So I would mainly use it if I wanted one image, like in the lower right corner throughout my sequence, or if it was part of a title that I'm doing, I would maybe do a few of these for the titles, you know, because you can set a background. Your background can be your video, your timeline. We can zoom in and out here. Just so as you know, by default, it's showing the source. You're going to want that to display the target, so you can see these changes being made. You know, and you can change your position. You know, and you can add keyframes and move it all around and have it swerve into frame. But this would be the best way to bring it in, because then you can extend this out as long as you want or as short as you want, and you don't have to worry about the baked media fixed duration that you get when you import images, and the compression down where Avid will, you know, make it smaller. So if you've got a very high res image and you import it, it's going to try and bring it down to your 1080 timeline. So just using a few images on your timeline, Avid Pan and Zoom is the way to go.
Righty-ho, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope that was interesting for some of you. You got something out of it. You learned something, hopefully. And congratulations for making it to the end. And if you did make it to the end and you're still watching this, then thank you very much. I know that some of this for established editing and Avid users can be a little bit back to basics, but some of that back to basics information, that grounding, is the most important. And we will be getting to more, you know, interesting assisting stuff later down the line, like syncing and online delivery and exports, that kind of stuff. You'll also be pleased to know that we're sort of back on to a bit of a release schedule now, so there'll be an Avid Quick Tips Shorts video every Tuesday, one of these videos in this AE series, and then back to normal, you know, standalone videos every Thursday, British Standard Time at 4 PM, you know, keep an eye out. And I'm also on Patreon now, so I'll have that linked below too. So if you really feel like you want to see more of this kind of content, I can't imagine there's too many of you, but a few people have got in touch to request it. So for those people, there will be 3 tiers, each with different levels of access, you know, so starting with just like early access to this kind of stuff, through to an exclusive series of how would I do it. So I'm approaching post-production issues and I'll show you how I would go about solving it if I come up against it, my own personal workflows. And as well, all the way up to, you know, downloadables. So I will send you, you know, custom-made Avid effects and countdown burn-in leaders, or, you know, project tracking templates that I've made, and spreadsheets and different things that you can use in your own projects. So if that's something that you think you may be interested in, it's linked down below. Go check it out, and hopefully you get something out of it. But this video has been on long enough. It's come to a close, so live long and prosper, and I'll see you next time.